All right, so we are going to be working our way into Unit 5 today, starting to talk system administration with Windows. Not a very long unit, just 2 blocks and then the assessment and stuff. But we've got a couple important things to cover while we're here. Hopefully you've got your lab open in front of you. You'll see up here at the top, we have 3 different machines as part of it. The first one that opens up should be the one that looks like this. This one is, I believe, Windows Server. System about, it's a little poke here. Yep, Windows Server 2016 Data Center Edition. So part of the reason we're looking at Windows, and really most of the reason we're looking at Windows, is because we're going to be looking at its relationship with the enterprise network. So we have servers running Linux, we can have desktops and laptops and everything running Linux, but in the world of enterprise computing, when we've got offices that are networked and everybody comes in and sits in the same spot and they need to trust that their computer is going to be the same every time they open it up, Windows is sort of the king there. And so we're going to look at how it works in those networks and a little bit about maintaining those machines. It looks like my Vocarium is having a little bit of a struggle with my display there, but we'll get through it. So as part of our warm-up, I first wanted to just sort of baseline everybody and see where we're at with Windows. So first I wanted to know if we were primarily Windows users going in, which is common. Again, Windows is very popular. It's used in most school networks. The rest are probably going to use Macs, although a lot of them now are moving towards things like Chromebooks, which are a whole different thing, running effectively a build of Android, which is based on Linux. But Windows is still incredibly popular. So let's see, most of us primarily Windows users, a couple of Mac users, which is not unexpected. If you have never used Windows before, then I can understand it being a little intimidating, especially because Linux and Mac kind of have a shared ancestry. Let's see, yeah, primarily a Mac OS 10 user, Armand. But otherwise, yeah, mostly Windows. You probably use them at home, at school, for gaming, what have you. Next question I wanted to see was, have we ever rolled up our sleeves, quote unquote, and done anything technically challenging on a Windows machine? And some of you all seem to really underestimate yourselves in terms of what I would consider a technical thing. Like, because remember, we're comparing to the baseline, a typical user who is honestly just impressed that they're able to turn the thing on and get it working to do the thing they want. Case in point, the first one I saw Alex mentioning, not super challenging, but some things with editing the registry and PowerShell. Those are definitely things that I would consider above and beyond the Call of Duty for your average Windows user, right? We'll talk about the registry and why it's kind of a nightmare, I think today. Let's see, some other people mentioning never rolling up their sleeves before. That's totally fine. Mohammed, reformatting drives using command prompt. That's always incredibly nerve-wracking the first time you do it. Let's see. James says, managing a spreadsheet that was on a server and updated by people in different locations. I've seen that used before. That can be tricky, especially when somebody is losing access to that server. And so now we're getting a bunch of competing versions of what's supposed to be there. Not really. Some troubleshooting, Elizabeth says, although I see Elizabeth mentioning being a Linux snob. That's fair. Let's see. Brandon had a help desk role, a lot of troubleshooting, didn't go too deep. Changing certificates was the furthest I felt comfortable with. That's definitely up there, though. Good stuff. Troubleshooting command line. Not much of a computer person prior to now. That's okay. Best time to start is today. Ah, dual boot. I've ventured there before. Having 2 different operating systems installed on the same machine so you can just pick which one you want when you start it up. All right. Now installing some new things manually, copy and paste command lines, Vic. Cool. All right. What were some of the biggest differences that we faced? I think mostly we're pointing out the emphasis on the command line, which is certainly true. There is a command line in Windows. We will be using it a bit, but it's far from the default assumption like it is in Linux. Very limited knowledge. Terminal that wasn't Windows, didn't realize it was a substitute for a GUI. It can be. In Windows, there's a little bit more of a line. There's certain things that you're probably better suited avoiding the terminal for. Unlike with Linux. Let's see. Found Linux more intimidating to learn, but it has more utility and totally worth it. I like that mindset. Windows can be easier for just typical use. Like if you're just somebody that is sitting in front of a machine and needs something to get them on the internet, get them to their email, get them to whatever documents they need to edit, heck, play games. Windows being the market dominator that it is in terms of its share of the PC market, puts it in a position where it can sort of treat itself like the default. And I believe Elizabeth mentioned something to the effect of, yes, possibilities are endless on Linux. Windows ties your hands. See, that's how I feel about Mac. Windows, it does sort of out of the box have a lot of guardrails in place. It's not wanting your average user to immediately shoot themselves in the foot trying to do, stunt computing, but and yeah, no forced updates on Linux. In the Windows environment, though, especially when we get into enterprise Windows, when everything is all hooked into the same domain and we've got one, Active Directory cluster that's sort of the big brain boss of everything, that's when we can really start saying, okay, here is exactly how I want Windows to work on everything in my network, which can be really useful, especially when we're talking security, because having standardized deployments and standardized images for every single device everybody uses really helps limit variables, which is a very good thing for us as security practitioners. And let's see, last question there I had. What are some things you're most curious about regarding the Windows OS? Let's see, Alex says, mostly what kind of things are we covering as relevant to cybersecurity work? And that's we're getting closer and closer to where we're shining that magnifying glass directly on the security aspect of things, right? We're still in this place where, okay, we're talking about the things we're securing and some of the choices we make in the architecture of our networks, but still not getting quite onto the, okay, but when does the hacking start? But this is where we'll start thinking about, okay, here's how all of these machines on a network with dozens or hundreds of computers can all be standardized, and that we don't have to, when we are administering these machines, we don't need to get down there and personally put hands on every single one of them to make things happen. We can distribute changes and configurations at scale. Let's see, looking forward to gaining new experience navigating in a new way on an old OS. Cool. The most exploited aspects of the system over time. That will come up a little bit when we start getting into red team and blue team. Although, just as an aside, I will mention Windows, it's built-in file sharing services where it's happy to, by default, open itself up and share files with other Windows machines. The artifacts of that SMB service have been haunting Windows for a very long time. Although not something that makes it permanently vulnerable, but it is something that when admins aren't aware of it, they can leave themselves open. That's how Eternal Blue worked. Let's see, minimizing processes and services on the OS without it affecting the basic workflow of apps on the system. That's getting into some definite power usage stuff, figuring out exactly what we need and what we don't need. We'll talk a little bit about some of the system processes, but not in a whole lot of detail there, unfortunately. Let's see, the server OS, because it's not much exposure to it. Luckily, server isn't too different than other Windows versions. It's just kind of the same Windowsy interfacing and some more, we'll say, user-unfriendly settings open on the back end, but not a ton of differences other than just having a few more tools installed. Most curious about how Windows can help do things for future jobs that Linux can't, and how to get around the Windows policy of handholding even if you don't need it. Yeah, using the registry, using Active Directory and domains can help that, but more at scale, right? If you're not going to want to set up an Active Directory domain for just one machine, but if you have a dozen of them and you need to standardize things and say, okay, we're updating all of these things right now, then that can certainly save you some time and prevent things from falling through the cracks. Corey says, curious to learn how Windows works. After doing Linux and Python, overall, everything about Windows, says Jordan, feels so lost when hit with a problem on Windows that requires me to do some digging, and it's been the only OS I've ever used. I hear you there. Windows can be tricky, especially when everything is sort of nebulous in where it lives. We'll talk about the registry and why it can be sometimes a pain to find where something lives in it, because sometimes things can live in more than one place for reasons that elude all but the most wizened Windows experts. Let's see, in general, all of it. Why is it so much bigger than Linux, but not open source? That's a good question. I would say that immediate adoption by the enterprise world probably had a lot to do with it. It became the operating system people were very used to using both at home and at work, and it just took off from there. Largely, people do not love learning new things. Curious about deeper aspects like the registry, advanced system diagnostics, and PowerShell. Cool. Got some good news for you there. Although I wish we could cover PowerShell in more detail. It gets touched on, I think, in one of the workshops. PowerShell is another scripting language that Windows features where you can have a more powerful command line. Everything excited to see how everything we've learned translates to Windows. Garrett says optimizing. And Brandon says how to make it secure and find vulnerabilities. Well, luckily, the settings and configurations we'll be looking at can have some definite security implications. So if we get it right, it'll put us in a good position. All right, let's see here. Don't think we have much to touch base on questions-wise from this one. Not a lot of, strictly speaking, technical content. But I will mention, if you have not gotten logged in, if you open the lab and it's staring at you with a username and password prompt, those credentials are at the very top of block 21. Username is fstack, password is academy. That's for all of these Windows VMs. I will also point out, it mentions we'll be using the desktop 1 VM for the exercises here in Canvas. These are different machines. They have different files on them. They might have different things installed on them. Oh, my mouse is disappearing from Vocarium. Lovely. Press that page, see what we get. Hold on a sec. Need to re-off. And just like this, fstack and Academy. Now, because I had already logged in to that Windows Server machine, and then I refreshed Vocarium, what happened was Vocarium lost its connection to the machine, so I had to sign in through that. But then the actual graphical display of the machine sees that it was locked. So we're seeing press Control-Alt-Delete to unlock. You cannot send Control-Alt-Delete to your VM using Control-Alt-Delete on your keyboard, especially if you're on Windows. Your own machine will think you're trying to tell it Control-Alt-Delete, which is a special key combination to open up a settings menu. It used to just be Task Manager. If you need to send Control-Alt-Delete in your Windows VMs, you need to go up to this drop down here with the name of the machine in it. It's going to say EC2 AMAZ and then some garbage. There will be a Send Control-Alt-Delete button. You click that, and then it simulates you typing those characters. And then you just need to type Academy there to get the rest of the way in. So this is the server VM. This should be the one that opens by default. I've seen sometimes where it isn't, which is a head scratcher. But if you want to open one of the other ones, you just click on its name and it'll open a pop-up. Where we can log in. Okay. Oh, now, what we may have seen over there before I clicked away was a prompt asking about some default firewall settings. This won't really come up in this lab, but later on when we're doing some red team and blue team stuff, we will actually be making sure we go in and deactivate the Windows firewall just so we can demonstrate some things without it getting in our way. The Windows firewall, for better or for worse, is actually a pretty solid piece of security software these days. And so teaching you all how to hack Windows with it in place is not quite a beginner task. So we'll make sure that we sort of go beginner mode there. That said, let me get my windows all sized up the way I need them. Before we move forward. All right. Anybody having issues getting into their Windows VM? All right. Now, before we dig in to this Windows machine, I want to point out in Canvas, under Unit 5 Systems Administration, there's this Windows versus Linux notes sheet. Just a handy cheat sheet with some comparisons between Windows and Linux for quick reference. I think I've got another one handy as well. There's a Geeks for Geeks for those of you who like those. I'll put that in both the usual spots. Because even though Windows doesn't have quite the focus on the command prompt that Linux does, Windows does still make it available. And so we want to spend a little bit of time talking about it because sometimes we need it. If you haven't used Windows much before, this icon down here is our start menu. and click on that to open a view with a lot of your applications and some directories holding more applications. And let's see if they moved it. Oh, it's under admin tools in it. You know what? We're going to do just the search bar, because I use that anyway more than I use the start menu. So down here, you can type search terms. The Windows search, frustratingly enough, tends to try to default to performing some online searching. There is a way that you can fully disable that, but you'll have to disable it every time you reset your lab. So I think more just sort of get used to it. But if you search a term like a command like CMD, it will find matching applications, best match command prompt app. When this comes up in the sidebar over here, we can see we can say open as well as run as administrator. In Windows, our super user permissions are locked behind administrator permissions. It's sort of like sudo on Linux. So if I click open, I will get a command prompt with standard user privileges. If I type CMD again and click run as administrator, or I can right click and run as administrator if it's not the one that pops up over here. See, it might be giving me a UAC prompt or trying to. Oh, there it goes. It's just being a little pokey. So what it's done here is it's hidden everything else on the screen and given me this fun user account control pop-up asking, do I want to allow this app to make changes to my device? This is it asking, hey, are you the one that wanted to run this as administrator? This is a security feature that was introduced several versions of Windows ago that forces Windows to prompt the user when certain administrative tasks are done for the first time. First time per session, rather. And so I have an administrator command prompt. And then I have a regular command prompt. Same actual terminal emulator and window and all that. Oop. I scrolled down a bit and so it's gone off there for me. And a prompt looks different than it looked on Linux. But it's really similar in its scope. Rather than telling me my user and host name and my path, it just tells me my path. In the administrator command prompt, it's saying I'm at C:/Windows/system32. And then on my regular one, I'm in C:/users/fstack.desktop and then desktop name identifier. Two different paths that get opened up, just like we had opened two different terminals in Linux to two different locations. That's all. Now that we're in here is when we can actually start sending some commands like dir for directory. What does this look like? What command in Linux? Yeah, ls. So one of the more common things you'll run into is typing your favorite Linux commands into Windows and it just not recognizing them. Happens all the time. And then when you get used to Windows, guess what? You'll come back and it'll happen in Linux. Although I do think Linux has an alias for dir built in. Now, some similarities. CD is still change directory. So if I were to say CD DES, I can still tab complete with tab and say CD desktop. And my prompt updates and says, here we are in the desktop now. Your users directory / desktop is the folder that is literally your desktop here. If I say dir, I will not see any of these things because this Firefox and the recycle bin, these are system shortcuts. But if I were to say new, and this is me right-clicking just on the desktop to open this context menu, I can make a new text document, call it new file.txt or whatever. And then I'll type ls wrong. And then I'll type dir. And I'll see, oh, new file.txt.txt. Windows, because I told it to make a text file, it assumed I wanted a .txt extension. But then when I typed the full name anyway, it just added it on there. So I can right-click, rename. A lot of right-click context menus in Windows. There we go, and then dir, and see that that's been updated. So just like in Linux, we can edit things, make changes in the GUI and the command line, and they're both going to be reflecting what's present on either end, as long as you're looking in the right spot. Let's take a look at some of these commands in here, and we'll talk about them as we go. So first thing it mentions here is our top level structure. Remember, in Linux, everything lives under root, no matter what physical drive it lives on. You can then mount storage to certain folder paths, and then that's the way it works out. In Windows, it's inverted, where everything on each drive is specifically mentioned by what drive letter it has. This folder icon down here will open your File Explorer. And this is an important window, because this is how we can browse files through the GUI, or graphical user interface, in Windows, which is generally going to be easier and faster than the command prompt, as long as there's no issues otherwise. Nope, I mean to click that, meant to dismiss it. I don't want to back anything up right now. Windows trying very hard to be helpful for me here. Here in the File Explorer, I want to point out just a few different elements here as we go. So over here, we have our sidebar navigation. You can find that little drag spot there, make it bigger. This is our sort of navigational tree. It starts with a quick access menu, which just has a few common folders, but these are going to be user specific. By default, there should be an entry for OneDrive. So it's just Microsoft trying to get you to use their cloud hosting service. But then this PC is sort of the actual primary place that we would start looking from. Now, we still have the same user-specific content directories, like my user's desktop, my user's documents, my user's downloads are all going to show up here, just similar to the quick access. But all of these folders are pointing as shortcuts to file locations on the actual storage drive. And right now we just have this one, our C drive. Who's been in a work or school network and seen a ton of other drive letters in place? Then what was the drive letter that you had to save all your personal stuff to? Anybody remember that? So D drives, Maria says a P drive, Elizabeth a G drive. Notice that as we stop getting into standardized drive letters, we can see some difference, because once we're out of, all right, C is sort of the default, this is our system drive. That's a holdover from A was a floppy drive and B was, I think, a zip disk drive on most standard PCs. And then the C drive for a hard drive came in, and then those other first two died and we never looked back. Never keep anything but Windows on my C drive. That's sometimes a pretty good practice to have. Sometimes you'll have people with one physical drive, but then they'll partition it to look like two, and then they'll say, all right, this is my system, and then this is my everything else. But then if you've been in a corporate or school network where it's like, I have this computer has its own storage, but then I have my own, like Elizabeth mentions the G drive. At my high school, it was the H drive. And that is a shared drive letter that is something that is via Windows Active Directory domains. We'll talk about setting the domain up later, but the idea being, if I can log in to any of 100 computers at my organization and give the same username and password and get the same stuff no matter which one I log into, that's certainly a good reason to go with Windows in those settings. And so Windows organizes everything by drive letter. In our VM, we just have the C drive. And then we can go down from here. We have program files. We have program files with x86. This is 32-bit compatible programs. Users, Windows, where we have our system stuff. The rest are going to have some variability, but your program files, user directories, and Windows, you can expect to be consistent across Windows OSs. On earlier versions, this users folder would have been called documents and settings, and then users was a subfolder of that. But nowadays, not so much. But notice as I open these things up, this sidebar pane keeps up with me. So rather than having to go through, I can just pop open these different trees of things. And find different folders from there. And then when I decide I want to open one, I just click it, and then the contents open over here. Up at the top, we have a menu title bar with a handful of tools under each tab. Things like renaming, copying, creating new items. Most of these things you can do by right-clicking as well. So right-click and then new folder. Anytime you see a shield icon on an operation, it's telling you you're going to need to be admin to do this. Now in Windows, this isn't saying go out, log back in as admin, and then do it. This is saying you're going to get prompted, and we'll see if you're allowed. Underneath our toolbar menu here, we have our path for quick access. When I was not clicked into it, notice it sort of breaks everything down into breadcrumbs. But then once I do click into it, it switches it over to just like a text-based path. So you can change the path and hit enter, and it'll just take you wherever you typed. If you just want to go to a specific directory that's in that chain, you just click on it. There's a search. The Windows file system search is a tricky one to praise, but it is there. Windows file system indexing is, in my experience, kind of slow. It's also, the searching is what we consider fuzzy, meaning it's going to give you a lot more than what you specifically strictly searched for, because it's going to treat you like maybe you misspelled something. But if I type like readme and hit enter, it will try and search based on wherever I was when I searched. Notice this search is not case sensitive. Windows in general, its file paths are not treated like they're case sensitive. And going. Let's see down here, it's just mentioning how many items it's found. Oh, that second one popped in and now it says 2 items. Just a little summary of what we were looking at there. If you click on something, it'll tell you a little bit more information. In this case, the size of it. Notice as I highlight things, they get checkboxes with the settings that I've currently got on. And should be the default. You can also control click to add to an existing selection as well. So here, if I go over here and I click on program files, and then I control click on users, and then control click on Windows, all 3 of those are selected. And then if I were to like delete or move them or something, it would move them all at once. Let's see here. Exploring around is the way to go, especially in these VMs. Remember, the worst thing that happens is we just nuke it from orbit and you start fresh. Notice your Windows has some built-in file sharing. And in every view of the file manager, you have a pretty solid amount of control over how things are displayed to you. You can do them as icons or tiles. I usually like the details list because it gives you some details, but sometimes you don't need all that. You just want to see thumbnails of your pictures. You click options from this view panel, you'll see change folder and search options, which will open a more detailed folder options view. Now, under the view tab of that, I want to point out hidden files and folders. In Linux, if I want to hide a file, how do I do that? Yep, put a dot at the beginning of the file name. That'll make it so it doesn't show up when we run ls unless we specify that we're looking for hidden files. In Windows, whether a file is hidden or not is a property of that file that you have to access via a right-click menu. Just like in Linux, though, this isn't for security purposes. This isn't us hiding our secret files. This is just hiding system stuff and things that we don't necessarily want cluttering up the folders that they live in. So you can click Show Hidden Files, Folders, and Drives, and then Apply. And that will apply immediately. So if I then go back to like my C drive, I can see a couple new items in there. This program data folder is there, and it's got a slightly transparent icon. This WinRE agent folder as well. So these were hidden folders. Now, all we had to do was just tell the file manager that we are interested in seeing hidden folders, and then we're able to go in. So don't treat that like it's a security feature. Just a convenience one. And if you want to hide it again, you can open those options, view, and then don't show hidden files, folders, or drives. You can click apply if you want to, of course, go ahead and apply the changes you've made without closing the box. I also want to point out here we had hide extensions for known file types. Remember when I had that new file.txt and then it hid the .txt? Well, you might want to turn off hiding file extensions. Because Windows by default is thinking, okay, you probably know it's a text file. We put an icon on it that tells you it's a text file. That's fine. But I don't want any ambiguity in my file names. So if I disable that, notice it even affects the desktop. So I can right click, go to properties and see new file.txt, not .text.text. And when I opened those properties, you can see under attributes, hidden is one of them. So I can hide that file. And now it does not appear to be on my desktop anymore, unless I go options, show hidden files. And there it is. There is also this hide protected operating system files option. Sometimes you'll want to uncheck this so that you can get at specific like OS system files that would normally be hidden even when you tell it to show hidden files. So sometimes if you're following a guide and it says there's a system file in a location and it absolutely doesn't look like it's there, go in here. Alexa VM crashed and isn't booting back up. You can go ahead and reset it if you're not able to get back in. So I'm going to go back to don't show hidden files, but I will turn off hiding extensions. There we go. Because I like seeing file extensions. What questions have we got so far? Waiting for UI to be ready. Let's see if it's doing that. Check, make sure you don't have another tab open that's prompting you for a username and password. And if so, I mean, then the reset button up here. This will fully reset everything. It's not going to give you a waiting for UI button. It did do that. All right, I will terminate your lab from my end then in a minute. Let's do a quick break. We're coming up at the top of the hour. We'll come back in 15 minutes, 11:15. Where do I go to see file extensions? I will show that one more time. So up here in our file manager, our file explorer, you go to the view tab of the menu, and then options. And you can do view, show hidden files. Oh, you mean extensions down here, hide extensions for known file types. Actually, it looks like they've got this as its own standalone thing up here now. That's new to me. So you don't need to go digging quite as far as you traditionally had to. It's just up here now. That's cool. And this is on the desktop one. The server one might behave a little differently. Let's go see. View. Nope, same deal. All right, folks. I will see you all in 15, and then we'll move on. All right. So before our break, we were looking at Windows. Let me get that back. There we go. And I'm going to show a couple more standard file operation commands just to get those finished out. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about some file parameters. So we've talked about using CD and dir. Remember, with dir, it's just like ls. With ls, though, we had some options where we could show different types of things, like hidden files or other directories. Well, dir and other Windows commands are going to be able to do very similar with different options, but they work differently between Windows and Linux. Whereas in Linux, we could have a man page. In Windows, most of your commands are going to have a special option /?. So if I type dir and then a space /?, that is me asking for help with the dir command. And very similarly to a man page, we get a description, displays a list of files and subdirectories in a directory. We get an example of how all these different options could be sort of used in sequence. Each set of square brackets defining something optional. And then several different options that we can use and what they do. Like /A displays files with the specified attributes. Like hidden files with H. System files with S. Press any key to continue. And it just continues scrolling the way down. We could scroll up and down in here just fine. So if I did dir /A, that is the default behavior for /A is going to show all files with all attributes. But we could specify A:/H and say I only wanted hidden files. Notice here we have this desktop.ini. We don't even see this one over here on our actual desktop. But that's because that one is a system file. That's one of the ones that the other option is telling it to hide. So dir /A for everything, or A:/H. I have to do a separate. I think new file might also have both, but if I did A:/S, there we go. So A:/S to only show system files, show desktop.ini, but not new file.txt. Desktop.ini is both a system file and a hidden file. So when we were specifying to show hidden files, it showed up there. We can inspect the attributes of a file with a different command, but I want to make sure that I'm covering everything else that I wanted to here before I move there. One moment. Looking at my notes. Yeah, I think we're good. The only other thing I'll mention is just like in Linux, we've got our cd ... to go up a directory. And just like with Linux, with ls, we could use wildcards. We can do that with dir as well. So if I said dir d*, it'll give me desktop, documents, and downloads. As long as I was in my user directory. Any questions on these commands in general as we're going through them? So there's some reading here on the file system structure. I've touched on most of this in some detail, but I do recommend reading through it more closely once you've got time. It mentions file extensions in Windows, and this is a big subject, not necessarily to memorize every possible file extension that's out there, but to recognize that Windows, unlike Linux, does care about file extensions. If I have my file, new file.txt, I'm real quick going to make that not a hidden file for now. I can double click it. It'll open up in Notepad and I'll say, hey gang, and save that file. Well, I can open that file and it'll say, hey gang, anytime I double click on it. It's just a text file. If I rename that file, and so it's not new file.txt and instead it's new file.jpg, it gives me this pop-up. If you change a file name extension, the file might become unusable. Are you sure you want to change it? I'll say yes in this case. And notice the icon changes. Windows says, okay, here's your picture. But if I try to open it, it's going to have a very bad time rendering an image out of just that few bytes of text that's in that file. It looks like we don't support this file format because we tried to open this very small JPEG and we couldn't. So Windows is picky about file extensions, which is yet another reason why I love making sure Windows always shows me the file extensions, just to help eliminate confusion. And this does mention a few good ones to be able to spot. Batch scripts, .bat. A batch script is basically like a bash script in Linux. The names being similar is 100% coincidence. But you can make a batch script named .bat made out of a bunch of different command prompt commands. If you open that file now, is it recovered or a new text file? Good question. It's still there. The data never got changed, just how Windows tries to open it. So Windows says, I'm going to try my best to treat this like an image, and then it can't, but the contents of the file did not change, thankfully. Good question. Let's see, we've got .doc for Word documents. That's less common now than .docx. You'll see that very commonly. DLLs, or dynamic link libraries. These are library files that Windows will use for various applications. Basically, think like a Python module. When we wanted to use the regex module in our Python script, we could just import the one that was built in. Well, Windows programs can do the same thing with DLLs. That way, not every one of them needs to have a whole separate batch of code for figuring out how to interact with your speakers, right? It just can use the Windows' standard DLL for that. So DLLs will come when you install applications and programs. EXE for executable. And .msi is a special Microsoft installer. So you'll sometimes find installable programs in both formats. So you'll have an EXE that you double click to install or an MSI that you double click to install. MSI is technically the one Microsoft would like you to distribute software in, but EXE is still very common. Then of course, .txt for plain text and .zip for a compressed archive folder. And let me double check and see if this is where I want to demo that. All right, so it mentions the zip, and I'm going to take a moment to show us how we can create those. So somebody remind me, what does archiving and compression do? Two separate concepts. What does each one do? Let's see. Archiving puts all the files in one folder. Compression makes that folder smaller. Smooth slams everything into a single file. Zipping condenses and makes it small. Yep. Although remember, so zip is a specific format, and it is one that we'll look at, but a zip file is trying to do both at once. So archiving to combine multiple files into one file, compressing to make a file smaller. So here, I'm going to make a text file, myawesomestory.txt. We'll say once upon a time there was a boy who was really, and I'm going to just like make a bunch of reallys there. Who needs word wrapping? Cool. And we're going to save that as my awesome story. You're welcome for that preview of my audiobook. And I'm just going to copy and paste that a couple of times. What I've done is I went right click, copy, and I'm just hitting Control V and pasting. I just want several copies of this text in there. And these are just in my documents folder right now by themselves. If I shift click, so if I click the top one to highlight it and then hold shift and click the bottom one, it'll select everything from the top to the bottom. As you have 8 items selected, totaling 2.49 kilobytes. But if I select all of those, I can do a right-click menu here. And since I have all of these selected, I need to be mindful that whatever I do, it's going to try to do with all of them. If I click open, I'm going to get 8 different notepad windows all open to my fun story. But I'm going to click send to compressed zipped folder. And then it wants me to name it. And there we go, myawesomestory.zip. If I double click it, I'll see they're all in there because Windows is able to treat zip archives like they're folders in most contexts. So when you go to open something, it will need to extract it manually, but I don't need to extract it to just double click into it and see, hey, here's what's in there. And so that zip file totals 1.48 kilobytes. We've saved a pretty good percentage-wise bit of space, almost half. And so you can zip multiple items together by selecting them all and then right-clicking and send to zip archive. You can also just do a whole folder. So if I went to my local disk C, then users, and then I found my directory here, I could do the same thing. I could right-click, send to compressed folder. This doesn't delete the old folder. Notice it's saying it can't create it right here under users because I'm not allowed to unless I'm admin. So do I want to place it on my desktop instead? Sure, that's fine. That'll go through and compress everything in my user folder, including all of my user settings and documents and stuff. Looks like it hit an error trying to do that at some point. Let's see if it, nah, it just fully gave up. Probably because I was backing it up to a location that it was copying from. Put myself in a little bit of a snake eating its own tail loop there. But the zip format for compression is the Windows default. Every Windows machine will be able to handle it just fine without installing anything else. You will see sometimes, though, people installing tools like 7-zip, just like in Linux. 7-zip is a common one for Windows, specifically because 7-zip is compatible with a lot of different types of archives and compression. So it's one tool that you can install to just basically be able to handle every archive you'll come across. 7-zip is pretty handy for that. I'll share. And here's what's open in Firefox. Give that a moment. Update now. Just wondering why it was struggling. There we go. Oh. We can just Google like 7-zip install. And you'll find this website. And you'll notice when you go to download things for Windows, sometimes you'll get different versions, like an exe download for 64-bit Windows or an MSI download for 64-bit Windows. When in doubt, compare to your system specs that you can find. You can right-click on your start menu. And you get all of these sort of super user, power user options here, including a run box, search box. And check out computer management. Oh, this is not the specific one. We'll be here eventually, I think, but I'm looking for maybe just system. Yes, here we go, system. And we can see processor. Now it's not specifying here. Generally, modern machines, if you see Intel, it's going to be 64-bit x64. But if you're ever in doubt, you can Google it. Just find your processor name, look it up, and you'll find its specs. Down here we can see system type, 64-bit operating system, x64 based processor. So you would go, say, okay, I know that it's x64, like it said, I can download that, and I can use either the exe or the MSI. This isn't, strictly speaking, part of the exercise or anything, but just a workflow that you might encounter setting up a Windows machine. Going, finding something to install, figuring out what version to install, and then doing it. We had looked at things like special file properties. Like I could right click and hit properties. And I can view everything about this file basically other than what is in it. I'd have to open it to see that. But here I can see where it physically lives, how big it is. I can see some create, modify, and access times. And then some attributes, read-only and hidden. Read-only should be self-explanatory. If that is set, we can't make changes to it. We can only read it. And hidden, of course, we'll just hide it from plain sight unless we tell our file explorer we want to see hidden things. There's also advanced. Notice here some default compression and encryption options. The Windows file level encryption is decent for if somebody steals your physical hard drive and can't boot up without booting into it or without logging in as you. Here what we'll do. I'm going to make this read-only and hidden. And I'm going to show, nope, not ls, dir, cd desktop, dir again, this time with /a. We'll make sure I can see. All right, new file.txt and desktop.ini are both in here. Command I want to show is attrib, short for attributes. You can just run it by itself if you want, and it'll show you the attributes of the files in your current directory. Now it shows those with these single letter signifiers. And if we're curious what those mean, remember we have our /?. So attrib, attrib /?, displays or changes file attributes. So if you just run it with the file path, it'll display a file's attributes, or you can do things like +r or -r, +a or -a, on and on. And then each letter is described down here. So H is for hidden files, S for system files, and R for read-only files. A is for archive. Most files by default are going to be set with that, basically meaning Windows backup should be told to consider them important files to back up. So run that one more time and see that desktop.ini is got A, S, and H. So it's set to archive, it's a system file, and it's a hidden file. Whereas new file is A, H, and R. So it's archivable, hidden, and read-only. If I wanted to, say, make it not hidden anymore, it's a attrib -H, and then the path to that file. Since I'm currently in my desktop, I can just say new file.txt. And a second later, it pops in on my desktop. Any questions on these properties, the attrib command, before we move on? Cool. Now, similar to properties, we have permissions. Permissions on a file in Windows work a bit differently than they do in Linux. Every file and folder is going to have a set of permissions that can be expanded across all the different groups and users on that system. Check here for this new file.txt. There are permissions for 3 different sets of users. One for system, one for fstack itself. Notice this is just a solo user icon, and then the group administrators. And as you click through them, they could have different permission sets down here. Permissions are divided into different groups, and each one is explicitly allow or deny. So notice on all of these, anybody in system or administrators or the fstack user themselves should be able to open and edit that file. We can edit those permissions, like it says, by clicking Edit. And when you're editing those, you need to go through one item at a time or one group at a time. But notice here, if I can stretch this out, I'll have to just scroll. I can't uncheck allow. And at the end of the day, the reason for that is because the permissions on this file are inherited. So this file lives in a folder. That folder lives in another folder. That folder lives in another folder, on and on up until your C drive. Each of those folders can have its own sets of permissions and who's allowed to do what. And inheritance is a big part of that. So I don't have to explicitly define permissions on everything in every folder. It's going to, by default, assume we'll inherit the same permissions as the folder we're in. And then we can change things from there. So because fstack has full control permissions over their entire desktop, as they probably should, we would have to go and change that on the desktop folder. And then if that one we can't change, we'd have to go up even further. So rather than removing that inherited allow, we could do an explicit deny. So what if I wanted to deny everything, deny full control? This gives me a little pop-up with a very important thing to remember about Windows permissions. You are setting a deny permissions entry. Deny entries take precedence over allow entries. That means if a user is a member of two groups, one that is allowed a permission and another that is denied the same permission, that user is denied that permission. Does that make sense to everybody, or does that leave us scratching our heads? Cool, I like a thumbs up. I'll hit yes, I do want to continue. And then now as I go through these permissions, I can see system and administrators are unchanged, but fstack, I myself cannot open it. I'll say, okay, I can go through here and see, okay, there are those deny entries in dark black instead of a gray. I'll say, okay. And then when I try to open that file, it tells me I don't have permission. See the owner of the file or an administrator to obtain permission. So it opened Notepad, but then Notepad was trying to open the file and it wasn't able to. Now, similarly to a trib, reviewing attributes, we can view the access control list. That's that permission set. The command for that is ICACLS. I pronounce that I cackles in my head. I'm not sure everything it stands for. You could look that up. I know the ACL is for access control list. And ICACLS, and then the path of the file. So we'll say new file.txt. If we just run it like that, we get a permission set. It says new file.txt, and then we see separate entries. And notice here, this very first one, desktop1/fstack, that is telling me the user fstack associated with the machine desktop1, so this machine. NT-authority/system, that's that system users group. Built-in/administrators, that's the administrators group. And then another entry for desktop1/fstack. That's fun. Well, each one has these different letters in parentheses after the colon. And if we wanted to tell what those different letters in parentheses might be, we could run question mark. Yep, ICACLS/question mark. And we can scroll and look through, give some examples. And it gives us plenty of information about how to run it. So iCackles, ICACLS will let us manually fix permissions for these files, although that syntax gets a little trickier. There's some examples, I think, in the exercise where you might have to set some ownership. So here, in this example, we can see ICACLS is the command, then name, so what file name are we working with, /set owner, space, and then the username. And then some optional flags there that we can then go look for. But if we're just reading, perm is a permission mask and can be specified in one of two forms, either a sequence of simple rights, including these letters here, or a comma-separated list in parentheses of specific rights. In our case, we'll mostly be seeing these as the simple rights, unless we went in under advanced, in which case we can really roll up our sleeves and do very specific permissions. Down here, we also see some inheritance rights, where we can see I is telling us that permissions were inherited from the parent container. So the folder containing whatever we were in, we inherited permissions from that. So what did we have? We had, first we just had an N, and then we had an I and an F. So if I go find my key here, N means no access. But then we also had I and F. So I telling me that that's an inherited permission, and F meaning full access. So we have two competing sets of permissions on this file for our user. One says, no, you cannot open this file. One says, my mom says I can open this file. But we can see that that explicit no is very specifically saying, no, you cannot open this file. Any questions here? The Canvas exercise here will walk you pretty well through what it's expecting you to do. Although it doesn't know the user or SID that you're working with. SID is the security ID. Basically, a long form ID number representing each user. But in our case, the user could just be fstack or administrator. There is a command mentioned here, take own. So take own will, just like it says, take ownership of a given file. But this has to be done with an admin command prompt. So that will walk you through doing that, because you will need, I believe at some point, you'll give ownership to the administrators group. I got you. I'll leave that for it then. So from there, we've looked here, we've discussed the file and folder properties. We've looked at compressing a file. Now, running programs, just to highlight a few different ways we can do that. So if we have a program like Calc, which is just a calculator, we can access it in a few different ways. We can go find it in our start menu sometimes. Calculator's in there. One plus one still equals two. Awesome. But we don't always have to go through that start menu. We can search for things. Calculator. And that'll pull up over there. We can run it directly by name if we have a command prompt. So here we go. I can just type calc or calc.exe. It's the full name of the command. But if it's a system command or a system executable, you can just call it by name. So calc or calc.exe will work as well. You'll also hear mention of the run box. Now, there's a keyboard shortcut to open the run box. But depending on your parent operating system, your OS might think you're doing something different and it won't take the shortcut. So I'll tell you the shortcut, but then I'll also show you the workaround. So the Windows key, also known as the super key. So if you're on a Mac keyboard, this will be your your command key, I believe. You hold that Windows or super key and hit R. And that should open a run box in your VM. If it opens one on your real machine, on your actual computer, you can go ahead and safely close that. And I'll show you the other way to open this up. And that is through this right-clicking the start menu and then clicking run. This will open just one little box where you can type a command, program, folder, whatever. So sometimes you might run CMD from here to open your command prompt, or we can type calc. And this is for any installed program that you know the executable name of. Oh, Firefox isn't installed as is not installed as a system one, but MS Paint will be. Hooray. So all these different commands and programs that you can run from the start menu, from the search, from command prompt, from the run box, all different ways to get you there. That's a pretty brief one, but important to note. So any questions there? Okay. Now we've got a couple sections left, but I think what we'll do is go ahead and get in our breakout rooms until lunch. We'll work on the exercises up through part 4. Spend a little time tinkering in Windows and getting our sea legs. And then we'll pick up the remainder with part 5 and 6, a little bit longer after lunch. So we'll let you break that up just a bit. So before we get into breakout rooms, to start working on parts 1 through 4, what other questions have we got? All right, we'll get into those groups. We'll spend the next hour on that. And then after lunch, we'll pull everyone back and we'll move on to the next bit.